Hello there, I'm Norah Kyle. This is Al Jazeera Live from Doha with special coverage of the genocide in Gaza 1 year on. One year of Israel's war on Gaza, and the US remains its biggest ally and largest supplier of arms. Despite widespread condemnation and critics calling him Genocide Joe, President Biden's stance towards Israel and his government's military and financial support remain steadfast. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Hulett begins our coverage.
From the moment Israel launched its counterattack against Hamas on October the 7th, there was little doubt about the allegiance of its ally, the United States.
I'm going to ask the United States Congress for an unprecedented support package for Israel's defense.
At almost $4 billion annually, the U.S. is the largest supplier of weapons to Israel. But in the past year, it's approved an additional $40 billion, mostly in military assistance. Much of that arsenal's been used to kill tens of thousands of people in Gaza, and now thousands more in Lebanon. Initially, a narrow majority of the American public supported Israel's war. But calls to cut military aid to Israel across college campuses and from within Biden's own party have been loud and widespread. Biden did pause one shipment of heavy munitions in May, but since then, his support for Israel has been unwavering.
Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel.
But with the U.S. presidential election less than a month away, and as the Democratic Party attempts to hold on to the White House and the Senate, analysts argue any cuts to Israel's military aid now would be political suicide.
In the few weeks before the election, candidates are looking for any leverage they can get with any voting bloc and money group. No one wants to give the other side an undue advantage at all. And that provides Israel with a moment of maximum impunity.
Even as the possibility of a conflict between Israel and Iran increases, there's little chance the flow of weapons to Israel will change, regardless of who wins the presidency in November. Kimberly, Al Jazeera, the White House.
Dov Waxman is a professor of Israel Studies and Political Science at the University of California. He says the US has not used the full leverage it has over Israel and its military strategy in Gaza.
Part of it stems from President Biden himself and his deep commitment to Israel and his reluctance to pressure Israel in a war that he believes is a just war against Hamas. There's also clearly a domestic political cost to using political pressure against Israel, and he's probably been reluctant to incur any domestic political cost. And I think he's probably overestimated his ability time and again to shift Netanyahu's thinking. He's got promises, sometimes concessions, sometimes from Prime Minister Netanyahu, only to find that after receiving those promises or concessions, Netanyahu's gone off and done something completely different. So I think it's partly his failure, but it's also the fact that the United States, for all its support for Israel, doesn't have as much leverage over Israel, or indeed over other US allies as it might wish. That has been the pattern now for the past year. The American officials, sometimes publicly, more often privately, have been making these pleas, have been giving advice to the Israeli government, and time and again that advice has been ignored, and those pleas have been ignored. Sometimes there have been minor shifts, but ultimately, the US administration hasn't really been able to affect how Israel has been conducting the war in Gaza, or now more recently, its escalation in southern Lebanon.
Well, earlier, my colleague Rob Matheson spoke to Norah, who is a professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She says the United States is part of what she calls Israel's genocide in Gaza.
Since day one, that its objective in the Gaza Strip is to depopulate it in order to resettle it in what is a conundrum that only Zionists can create, something of the sort of Nakba peace, that through the ethnic cleansing and the genocidal removal of a people, that would be the only way to establish long-term stability. They have framed that as an attack on Hamas and sold it to a Western, primarily a Western audience that is already cloaked in Islamophobic tropes, anti-Palestinian racism, in order to understand Palestinians and Muslims as latent threats who, frankly, in their mind, did something already and deserve to die. And so even in their lives, they are, they're alive on probation until they prove otherwise. And so that's why we've seen Israel pursue a genocidal campaign for over a year now. And yet these very racist tropes that have been debunked repeatedly by analysts, by academics, by activists, by organizers, by UN experts, by UN bodies, by the International Court of Justice, by the International Criminal Court, have all been disregarded. And in the place of that, what we have are the prevailing racist colonial tropes that continue to guide us into what is unfolding into the conflagration everybody warned it would be. And the primary cost is borne by Palestinians, an entire generation whose future is on the line.
When Western politicians particularly are asked to respond to the situation between Israel and Gaza, they usually start with a stock phrase, don't they? They acknowledge Israel's right to defend itself, and then they say the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. But it always comes in that order. Israel first, Palestine second. What's your analysis of why that phrasing is used?
I think it's precisely in order to, it makes clear the order of human life and the value of human life. We have seen on display, not just since October 7th, but well before that, for nearly 8 decades now, this racial hierarchy that prefaces and makes supreme Zionist, Israeli life and the future of Israel as needing to exist as it does, as a Jewish demographic majority, which is predicated on the constant removal of Palestinians. It's a pact that's been made within the international community that the expenditure, that the loss, that the cruelty against Palestinians is a price worth paying. And yet Palestinians again and again every day, in moments of being pummeled and in moments of rising and resistance, have challenged this Western racist discourse, which is blatantly a colonial one, explaining that that is not an equation that is viable, and that Palestinians do exist, that Palestinian life is worthy, and that colonialism is still an illegitimate form of governance. I just want to add something in terms of what the law has to say about this. South Africa, apartheid South Africa, the United States, as well as Portugal during its colonial regime, tried to insist that they had a right to use force against their colonies, and they described it as self-defense, and that has been rejected. No colony, no settler colony has the right to use force in order to maintain its territorial holdings, and that is precisely what we're seeing right now. The problem is that colonialism has been made invisible to people so that they don't understand what it is and they don't have the language to use it. And so much of the activism and the scholarship and the work of this past year has been to illuminate that to the world, that we are not in a post-colonial order, but that we continue to exist under colonial regimes.
America, obviously, the US governments invariably say that it defends, as we were just saying, Israel's right to defend itself against armed groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran as well. At the same time, of course, the number of predominantly Palestinian civilians who are killed in the crossfire rises and rises. We're now at least 42,000 in Gaza. As allegations of complicity in genocide continue to grow and calls for some sort of accountability, how hard does it become for the US to defend itself against those allegations?
I think that the U.S. has already shot itself in the foot, exposed itself as not only supporting Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people, but being a primary source of it. This is a U.S. genocide against Palestinians. What we're seeing in the expanding war front is that this is a U.S. war against Arab regimes and across the Middle East, a continuation of what we saw in the illegitimate, illegal attack on Iraq in 2003, aimed at regime change, now continuing into the present under the auspices of self-defense, but which we must understand as colonial aggression. Palestinians have not been killed in brutal crossfire. Palestinians have been targeted. They are the target of attack. Their destruction is the objective of Israel's operation, as much as has been made clear by their deliberate starvation, the attack on their residential buildings, the decapitation of their hospitals so that they cannot even be treated, the denial of safe quarter, the sniping of children twice in the head, as we've been told, and their continuing strangulation. And so the first and primary objective must be to end the genocide and then to exact accountability for it. So when we say never again, it means never again for anybody and not just those who exist within European society.
Well, let's take a look now at the vast amounts of American weapons sent to Israel, allowing it to sustain its onslaught on the Strip. Our defence editor, Alex Gotopoulos, takes a look.
The United States has been by far the chief supplier of arms to Israel for its war on Gaza, and the numbers are simply staggering. Washington has allocated over $21 billion worth of military aid to be spent only on American-made weapons. In the past year, more than 500 military cargo planes and 107 ships have supplied Israel with 75,000 artillery shells, 14,900 kilogram bombs, 6,500 226 kilogram bombs, 3,000 Hellfire missiles, 1,000 bunker buster bombs, and 2,600 airdrop small diameter bombs. To give you an idea of the scale of destruction wrought on the Gaza Strip in the last year, let's compare some of the numbers with the events of the Second World War. 15,000 tons worth of explosives were dropped on Hiroshima, 21,000 tons on Nagasaki. The bombing of Dresden, 2,700, plus the destruction of Hamburg at 16,000 tons. And the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 required 1,510 tons of explosives. All of which adds up to a total of 56,210 tons. Still nowhere near the staggering 85,000 tons of high explosives Israel has dropped on Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas on earth and with nowhere to go for its people.
Well, just a little earlier, my colleague Tom McRae spoke to Kurt Volker, who is a former US ambassador to NATO. He began by asking about the connection between the supply of US military aid and 42,000 Palestinians killed by Israel.
I think you have to take the whole context. You can't just pull out the amount of ammunition supplied. We have Iran backing Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. We have terrorist attacks against Israel. We have Israel responding to that. It's a horrific situation, and a lot of civilians have suffered as a result of this. But it's not just one thing. It's the whole picture you have to look at.
But the war wouldn't have been able to have been carried out in the way that it has if there hadn't been so much support, militarily especially, for Israel.
Well, on the one hand, that's right. On the other hand, if you didn't have support for Israel, then you would have continuing attacks against Israel in a different form than we currently have. So there's no simple answer to any of this. What I do think is, and this was part of your earlier segment, the United States has urged a lot of restraint on Israel, has urged them not to launch ground invasions in Lebanon, for example. And Israel has not paid attention to that.
Just on that point, why do you think that that message has not gotten through? Because we've heard that time and time again from the United States, from the White House, from the State Department, from many, many politicians, that Israel should restrain itself when it comes to Gaza and other actors in the region. But clearly, after 12 months, tens and tens of thousands of people dead, it hasn't done that.
Well, exactly. Israel has not heeded those calls for restraint. And I think the main reason is that they feel that they are really on their own. They don't feel that the U.S. is fully backing them. And so they feel they need to take matters into their own hands. And this particularly has to do with deterring future attacks. I think Israel feels that the United States has not taken Iran's threats and actions seriously enough, and so is having to take on these things itself. It's an unfortunate spiral of events the way this has gone.
Well, the US has repeatedly shielded its ally Israel at the UN Security Council. 11 days into the war, it blocked a resolution Brazil had tabled calling for humanitarian pauses to allow UN agencies safe access to Gaza. The US said it was prioritizing diplomatic efforts on the ground. At the time, Israeli bombardment had killed 3,500 Palestinians. In December, it had blocked a resolution put forward by the United Arab Emirates calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The US said this would only plant the seeds for the next war. 17,500 Palestinians had been killed by then. And in February, the US rejected a resolution drafted by Algeria demanding an immediate ceasefire. Instead, it pushed for a temporary truce tied to the release of the Israeli captives. It said a ceasefire could jeopardize negotiations. Israeli attacks had killed more than 29,000 Palestinians. Victor Gao is the vice president of the Center for China and Globalization and a former Chinese Foreign Service officer. He says the US has to stop Israel from committing crimes against Palestinians.
Without US support, I don't think Israel can continue to carry out all these atrocities against the Palestinians and now spilling over to bombing Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East. I think the United States government is fully intertwined with what the Israeli government is doing right now against the Palestinians. And I think this fully reveals that the United States is not a true friend of the Arab people or of the Palestinian people or of the Muslim people at large. And I do think the United States need to reflect upon its behavior and really achieve consistency in whatever rules that they are preaching to the rest of the world, because mankind really has eyesight and has brain, and they can see what they are doing and come to their own conclusion. It is time for the United States to really rise up to the occasion and stop the atrocities committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. The world is watching. Mankind is watching what the United States will do.
Andrei Fedorov is former Russian deputy foreign minister. He says Moscow is concerned about further escalation, but it's difficult for it to influence events.
The problem of the conflict is that it's on the way of further escalation and a risk of clash, real clash, not artificial, but real clash between Israel and Iran is growing. And this can destabilize not only this region, it can destabilize globally the whole international political life, economic life as well. And of course, it's in the interest of Russia to at least, if not stop, but to lower down this tension. But frankly speaking, at the same time, our problem today is that Russia, in certain way, lost its influence on Israel, like it was before, and there are no possibility to influence on Netanyahu personally. That's why this is an obstacle. From the other side, Russia is on the way to sign a 25-year agreement with Iran, in the same way like Iran signed with China. And from this point of view, Russia needs to keep contacts with Iran. Russia needs Iran as a point, an important point in the north-south transport corridor. So this is a little bit blocking our Russian effort. We cannot be tough on both sides.
Well, Western governments have been accused of hypocrisy, with double standards laid bare in their reactions to Israel's war. It stands in stark contrast with Washington's stance against Russia with its war in Ukraine, and has diminished credibility in what US administrations like to invoke time and time again, the idea of an international rules-based order. Here's a glimpse of some of that contrast.
So we have made clear that there have been atrocities committed by Russian forces. We support a range of international investigations into Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, including the one conducted by the ICC. The United States fundamentally rejects the announcement today from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that he is applying for arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials together with warrants for Hamas terrorists.
I believe most of us share many of the same goals. First and foremost, we want to see an immediate and sustained ceasefire.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution raise their hand? Abstention.
It's hard to look at what he's doing in Ukraine, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, and think that any ethical, moral individual could justify that.
And being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties and that there likely will be more is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy. I've said that before.
Yesterday, President Biden said that, in his opinion, war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. Personally, I agree. Intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. After all the destruction of the past 3 weeks, I find it difficult to conclude that the Russians are doing otherwise.
The message that I bring to Israel is this: you may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never ever have to. We will always be there by your side.
Let's bring in Al Jazeera's senior political analyst, Maram Bashar. Now, he's in London and joins us live. So we know that Biden had a phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu today, the first one in almost 2 months. The White House is saying it was 30 minutes long. It was, quote, direct and productive. What can we read into that?
Well, from the statement, not much, right? Because the statement is meant to obfuscate what is going on. It's spinning. So actually, we don't know what went on, because productive could mean we agreed on to bombing the hell out of Iran, or productive could have meant, well, we agreed not to bomb the hell out of Iran. We don't know what productive means, right? And we also don't know if it was productive at all, and they just want to, keep up the appearance of civil American-Israeli relations. We don't know. What we do know is that the Americans have lied to us again and again and again. They lied to us notably when it came to the idea of blocking humanitarian aid, and they lied to us repeatedly on the question of a ceasefire, or the absence of it, or the imminency of it. And that was especially Antony Blinken, who was, the spinner in chief, if you will, of American diplomacy, always telling us lies. So I think the basic wisdom is don't trust and verify.
Would you say, Maran, that it's the US lying to the world again and again, or is it Netanyahu lying to the US, going along with this idea, for example, of a ceasefire until the last minute when he doesn't?
I think the United States knows all too well what Netanyahu was up to, because we know from various leaks. For example, right, Biden said to certain people in a fundraiser in Washington, Netanyahu is pursuing this for his own interest, personal interest. Netanyahu would like to prolong this war, or Netanyahu is going to do the land invasion. So I think America, in terms of its capacity for intelligence, its contacts with Israel, and so on and so forth, and their knowledge, their intimate knowledge of Netanyahu, with whom they worked for 25 years, they know he's the ultimate liar. I mean, they know he's a pathological liar. That's at least the only thing that the British, French, and the American leadership once agreed to when Obama was in the White House. But be that as it may, there's no doubt that Netanyahu is the pathological liar, but he's transparent. right? We know he lies all the time. The United States tried to be more intelligent about it, so it's spinning it all the time. And that's why we have the Matthew Miller's types, right? They're always trying to put, a kind of a soft spin on most things, that America cares for the value of human life, while at the same time, more than 40,000 people are killed in Gaza.
And they may try and put a spin on it, but at the end of the day, it's not hard to see that they don't use the only leverage that they have, which is sending the weapons to Israel. How do you think this has damaged or altered the US's standing at home and in the broader world?
Laura, as a student of Israel-American relationships, I can tell you, and I can actually remind our viewers around the world at each and every occasion when the United States did pressure Israel, use its leverage. For example, 1991, the Bush senior administration decided to freeze any economic aid that had to do with the so-called loan guarantees to Israel, as long as Shamir did not join the International Peace Conference in Madrid. Period. They said, you will be punished. At the time, Secretary Baker said, we're not going to call you. If you need us, call us, and here's the White House phone number. It was a direct rebuke of the Israeli government, and the Israeli government listened. In 1982, a decade before that, the United States wanted to sell AWACS airplanes to Saudi Arabia. Israel said no. It's lobbying Washington, lobbied against the sales of $8 billion of AWACS. It was a national American interest. So America told Israel to go to hell and sold the AWACS to Saudi Arabia. It was at the time the Reagan administration was one of the closest administrations to Israel. But when push comes to shove and America thinks Americans' interests are at stake, they put the necessary leverage on the Israelis to do what the Israelis must do as a client, rogue or not rogue. In this case, for me, and this is probably the most important line I will say today, maybe I'll say this year, is there any reason why the United States should pressure Israel when the elections are coming, when American interests are being served, when Arab leaders continue to beg and appease the American administrations, when the Palestinians are divided, when the Europeans continue to walk in the American footsteps? Why should Biden use a political capital, use leverage with a Netanyahu government, right? When there is no one asking for it in the Middle East? Not really.
Yeah, very interesting indeed, Maram. Those questions need to be asked. They're not being answered. But thanks especially for that historical context that you give us there on the situation. Now, since the start of the war on Gaza, thousands of Jewish American activists across the US have been calling for a ceasefire and advocating for Palestinian liberation. We spoke to Aaron Dardic, a student activist and founder of Columbia University's Jews for Ceasefire. This is his story.
My name is Aaron Dardic, and I'm a student activist at Columbia University. My family moved to the West Bank when I was 13 years old. It was a very different environment from California. My process for reevaluating my own beliefs was a gradual one, but truly I would say the March for Return, when Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, was a very pivotal turning point for me, as I was able to see what was effectively a peaceful protest met with a tremendous amount of violence from Israeli security forces. I was unwillingly drafted into the IDF in 2020. I conscientiously objected to the lead up to the 2021 Israel-Gaza war. I spent 4 months over the course of 8 court-martials and 6 imprisonments in military detention. In the wake of October 7th, I honestly remember very little. I was calling my family every day. I was crying a lot. In my grief, also realized that there didn't feel like a place for me to authentically organize on campus with the language that I wanted to use and with the message that I wanted to put forward. I participated in the encampment last spring despite not aligning with the views of many of the people who were in it, because I believe that those were goals that were worth fighting for.
I saw that when things were quiet, nothing changed.
I'm a founder and lead organizer in Columbia University's Jews for Ceasefire. We are an organization that is fighting for a collective liberation of all people, especially Israelis and Palestinians, who are suffering under the current Israeli government and under Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And I believe in the Jewish community's ability to recognize that this is an authentically better way forward for everyone, because peace and a strong moral fiber are things that are better than war.